In 1828, the isolated valleys of territorial Utah harbored what would become known as America's most disturbing genetic mystery, the Belmont family. For 3 generations, the Belmonts had lived in complete isolation on their sprawling ranch, 20 miles from the nearest settlement. What neighbors dismissed as mere eccentricity, the family's pale, gaunt appearance, their reluctance to venture into town, and their strange habit of speaking in whispers masked a horrifying reality that would challenge everything Victorian America believed about bloodlines and divine providence. When traveling physician Dr. Samuel Cartwright arrived to treat what he assumed was a simple case of consumption, he discovered physical anomalies that defied medical explanation. Children with identical facial deformities, adults whose limbs bent at impossible angles, and a pattern of mental deterioration that seemed to accelerate with each generation. But it was the family's meticulous genealogical records, kept with religious devotion in leather-bound ledgers, that revealed the true scope of their curse. By winter's end, Dr. Cartwright would uncover a genetic nightmare spanning decades. 3 family members would be found dead under mysterious circumstances, and the remaining Belmonts would disappear into the Utah wilderness, leaving behind only their horrifying legacy and a question that would haunt the territory for generations. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. Perhaps we will uncover a story there. The winter of 1828 brought Dr. Samuel Cartwright to the remote settlement of Cedar Ridge, Utah Territory, where the mountain winds carried whispers of isolation and strange family secrets. His leather medical bag bounced against his horse's flank as he navigated the treacherous mountain passes, following a trail that seemed to lead away from civilization itself. The harsh December cold bit through his wool coat, but it was the stories he had heard in Salt Lake City that truly chilled him to the bone. Cedar Ridge existed as little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the base of towering peaks, their wooden frames groaning under the weight of accumulated snow. The settlement served the scattered ranchers and trappers who called these isolated valleys home, men and women who had chosen distance from the world over the comforts of civilization. Dr. Cartwright had expected hardship in this frontier posting, but he had not anticipated the peculiar atmosphere that seemed to permeate every conversation and sideways glance. Thomas Whitmore, the local sheriff, met him at the modest inn that served as both lodging house and gathering place for the community. Whitmore was a man of perhaps 40 years, his face weathered by mountain winters and marked by the kind of careful expression that suggested he had learned to guard his words. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a wariness that Dr. Cartwright found immediately unsettling. "Doc, I'm grateful you made the journey," Whitmore said, gesturing toward a table near the fireplace. "We've got situations up here that require someone with proper medical training. Most folks handle their own ailments, but there are times when that just isn't sufficient." Dr. Cartwright settled into the wooden chair and accepted the offered coffee, noting how the sheriff's gaze seemed to drift toward the mountains beyond the frost-covered windows. "I understand there's a family requiring medical attention. The message I received mentioned consumption, possibly affecting multiple members." The sheriff's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Belmont family, yes. They've got a ranch about 20 miles north of here, up in the high valley. Been there since before this settlement was even established. Old territorial family, you might say. Keep to themselves mostly, which is their right, but lately they've been requesting medical assistance." Around them, the inn's other occupants seemed to lean closer to their own conversations, but Dr. Cartwright noticed how voices dropped whenever the Belmont name was mentioned. The minister, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, shook his head slowly when he caught the doctor's questioning look. "Peculiar situation, that family," the minister said, approaching their table with obvious reluctance. "Haven't seen them at services for near 3 years now. Used to come regular, though they always sat in the back and left before anyone could speak with them proper. Always seemed to be whispering among themselves, like they had secrets that couldn't wait for the sermon to end. Dr. Cartwright found himself increasingly intrigued by the obvious discomfort these mentions produced. Are there particular medical concerns I should be aware of? Consumption can manifest differently in isolated populations, especially where proper nutrition might be compromised. Whitmore and the minister exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual reluctance to discuss it. The sheriff cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Doc, the Belmonts are what you might call protective of their privacy. They don't take kindly to questions or unnecessary interference in their affairs. When you meet them, and you will because they've specifically requested a physician, I'd advise keeping your focus strictly on the medical matters at hand." The trading post owner, a robust woman named Martha Henderson, overheard this exchange and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to speaking her mind. "Dr. Cartwright, I run the supply business here, and I can tell you the Belmonts are strange folk indeed. Send only one person to trade, always the same fellow, comes monthly like clockwork, pays in silver, never haggles, and speaks barely enough words to complete his business. Been that way for longer than I've been keeping this post." She paused, glancing around to ensure she had the attention of those present. "But here's the peculiar thing, Doc. That man who comes to trade, he's got the palest skin you ever did see, almost like he's never spent a day in the sun despite living on a ranch. And his hands, well, they're not quite formed right. Fingers don't seem to bend the way they should. Always keeps them covered with gloves, but you notice these things when you're handling money and goods." Dr. Cartwright felt the first stirrings of professional curiosity mixed with something approaching unease. Physical abnormalities in isolated populations were not uncommon, but the secretive behavior described suggested something more complex than simple genetic variation. "Has anyone else visited their ranch recently? Other medical practitioners, perhaps clergy members?" he asked, directing his question to the group that had gathered around their table. The minister shook his head slowly. "Dr. Patterson was here 2 years back, made a house call to the Belmont ranch. Left town the very next day without a word to anyone. Haven't seen hide nor hair of him since, and he was supposed to be establishing a regular practice here." Sheriff Whitmore stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Doc, I think it's best if we focus on the present situation. The Belmonts have requested medical assistance, and you're here to provide it. Tomorrow morning, I'll have one of their people meet you here to guide you to the ranch. The mountain paths can be treacherous for someone unfamiliar with the territory." As the group began to disperse, Dr. Cartwright remained seated, staring into the flames that danced in the fireplace. Something about this assignment felt fundamentally different from the routine medical calls he had handled throughout his career. The combination of extreme isolation, secretive behavior, and physical abnormalities suggested a situation that might challenge both his medical expertise and his understanding of human nature itself. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the inn's windows and carrying with it the promise of secrets that had remained buried in the mountain valleys for far too long. The next morning brought a figure wrapped in so many layers of dark fabric that Dr. Cartwright initially mistook the approaching form for a traveling merchant. The person moved with deliberate steps through the snow toward the inn, their face completely obscured by a heavy veil that seemed excessive even for the bitter mountain cold. Only when the figure spoke did he realize this was a woman, her voice carrying an unusual cadence that suggested careful consideration of each word. "Dr. Cartwright, I am Sarah Belmont," she said, her tone formal and distant. "I have come to request your medical assistance for my family's condition." Even through the multiple layers of clothing, Dr. Cartwright could observe that Sarah Belmont possessed an unusually slight frame, almost fragile in appearance. Her gloved hands remained clasped tightly together, and she maintained a careful distance that seemed to exceed normal social boundaries. Most striking was her voice, which carried a peculiar resonance, as though she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Mrs. Belmont, I understand your family is dealing with consumption. I would be happy to examine the affected individuals and provide appropriate treatment," Dr. Cartwright replied, noting how she seemed to flinch slightly at the word examine. Sarah's veiled head turned toward the mountains, and she remained silent for several moments before responding. "The condition affects multiple members of our household. We require treatment that can be provided at our ranch, as travel is difficult for those who are suffering." Dr. Cartwright found himself studying what little he could observe of her physical presentation. Despite the heavy coverings, he noticed that her posture seemed unusual, as though she were compensating for some physical limitation. Her breathing, too, appeared labored, though whether from illness or the effort of walking through snow remained unclear. "I would be willing to make house calls, certainly. However, I should mention that proper diagnosis often requires examination in conditions with adequate lighting and space. Consumption can present with various complications that might not be immediately apparent." At this, Sarah's entire form seemed to tense, and she took an additional step backward. "Dr. Cartwright, our family values privacy above most considerations. We have lived in these mountains for many years without outside interference, and we prefer to maintain our arrangements as they have always been. Your examination and treatment must be conducted within the bounds of our household and according to our customs." The emphasis she placed on the word customs struck Dr. Cartwright as particularly significant, though he could not immediately determine why. There was something in her tone that suggested these customs involved more than simple modesty or religious observance. "Of course, Mrs. Belmont, I am accustomed to working within the preferences of my patients and their families. However, I must ask about the specific symptoms you have observed. Consumption can manifest differently depending on various factors, and understanding the progression of the illness will help me prepare appropriate treatments." Sarah's gloved hands moved nervously, and Dr. Cartwright noticed that even through the thick fabric, her fingers appeared to bend at unusual angles. She seemed to become aware of his observation and quickly clasped her hands behind her back. "The symptoms include weakness, difficulty breathing, and a persistent cough that affects multiple family members. There are also physical manifestations that we believe may be related to the illness, though we are uncertain about their exact nature. Physical manifestations beyond the typical respiratory symptoms." "Yes," she replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Changes in appearance and physical capabilities that have developed gradually over time. My husband believes these may be consequences of our isolation and the harsh mountain environment, but we would welcome a medical opinion." Dr. Cartwright felt his professional curiosity intensifying. While consumption certainly could cause various physical complications, the combination of Sarah's evasive manner and obvious anxiety suggested something more complex than a straightforward respiratory ailment. "Mrs. Belmont, I notice that you seem to be experiencing some discomfort yourself. Would you allow me to conduct a preliminary examination here, simply to better understand what I might encounter when I visit your ranch?" The suggestion produced an immediate and dramatic reaction. Sarah stepped backward so quickly that she nearly lost her footing in the snow, and her breathing became visibly more labored. "No, doctor, that is not acceptable. Any medical attention must be provided at our ranch, and only after you have met with my husband. He is the head of our household and must approve all arrangements." Her reaction was so extreme that Dr. Cartwright began to suspect that whatever afflicted the Belmont family extended beyond simple illness into territory that might challenge his understanding of medical conditions entirely. The combination of extreme physical concealment, unusual speech patterns, and apparent physical abnormalities suggested possibilities that his medical training had not fully prepared him to address. "I understand, Mrs. Belmont. When would be convenient for me to visit your ranch?" "Tomorrow morning. I will send someone to guide you, as the mountain paths can be treacherous for those unfamiliar with our valley." However, Dr. Cartwright, I must emphasize that our family requires complete confidentiality regarding any observations you make during your visit. We have maintained our privacy for many years, and we expect that arrangement to continue. The intensity with which she delivered this warning suggested consequences that extended beyond simple social embarrassment. Dr. Cartwright found himself wondering what exactly the Belmont family was so desperate to conceal, and whether his medical expertise would prove adequate for whatever awaited him in their isolated mountain ranch. As Sarah Belmont departed, her form once again becoming indistinct against the snowy landscape, Dr. Cartwright remained standing outside the inn, contemplating the unusual nature of the case he had just accepted. The guide who arrived the following morning appeared to be cut from the same peculiar cloth as Sarah Belmont. A young man of perhaps 25 years, he possessed the same unnaturally pale complexion and careful, measured movements that Dr. Cartwright had observed in Sarah. He introduced himself simply as Matthew and spoke only when necessary to provide directions along the treacherous mountain path. The journey to the Belmont Ranch required 3 hours of careful navigation through terrain that seemed deliberately designed to discourage visitors. The path wound through narrow passages between towering rock formations, crossed frozen streams on questionable bridges, and climbed to elevations that left both horses breathing heavily in the thin air. Dr. Cartwright noted that Matthew seemed intimately familiar with every turn and obstacle, suggesting he had traveled this route countless times. As they approached the final ridge before the ranch, Matthew suddenly reined in his horse and turned to face Dr. Cartwright with an expression of unmistakable anxiety. "Doctor, before we proceed, I must inform you that Mr. Belmont has specific expectations regarding your visit. You are to examine only those family members he designates, ask only medical questions directly related to their treatment, and avoid discussion of family history or personal matters." The formality of this warning, delivered by someone who appeared barely old enough to speak with such authority, struck Dr. Cartwright as both unusual and concerning. "Matthew, I appreciate the guidance, but I must be able to conduct thorough examinations if I am to provide effective treatment. Medical diagnosis often requires understanding various aspects of a patient's background and living conditions." Matthew's pale features tightened with what appeared to be genuine fear. "Doctor, please understand that Mr. Belmont has been managing our family's affairs for many years without outside interference. He knows what is best for our household, and he expects his instructions to be followed precisely." The way Matthew referred to "our family" rather than "the family" suggested a relationship more intimate than that of a simple ranch hand or guide. Dr. Cartwright filed this observation away as potentially significant while continuing to study the young man's physical appearance. Like Sarah, Matthew exhibited subtle abnormalities in his posture and hand positioning that suggested underlying structural irregularities. The Belmont Ranch itself, when it finally came into view, presented a striking contradiction between obvious prosperity and defensive isolation. The main house was substantial, built from local stone and timber in a style that suggested both permanence and considerable financial investment. Multiple outbuildings surrounded the central structure, including what appeared to be workshops, storage facilities, and living quarters that could house a large extended family. However, the entire compound was surrounded by barriers that seemed designed more for keeping people out than keeping livestock in. High fences, strategically placed buildings that blocked sight lines, and narrow access points created an environment that felt more like a fortress than a family ranch. Dr. Cartwright noted that windows facing outward were small and positioned high on the walls, while those facing the interior courtyard were larger and more numerous. Matthew led him directly to the main house, where they were met at the door by Sarah Belmont, still heavily veiled but now wearing different clothing that seemed designed for indoor wear. She gestured for them to enter without speaking, and Dr. Cartwright found himself in a parlor that demonstrated both refined taste and curious isolation from contemporary fashion. The furnishings were well made but appeared to be decades old, as though the family had acquired everything they needed at some point in the past, and then ceased all contact with the outside world of commerce and style. Most striking were the numerous framed portraits that covered nearly every wall, displaying what appeared to be multiple generations of family members arranged in formal poses. Dr. Cartwright paused to examine these portraits more closely, and immediately noticed something that made his medical training alert him to potential complications. The facial features displayed across the various portraits showed remarkable similarities, not just in the way that family members typically resemble each other, but in specific structural characteristics that appeared with unusual consistency across what should have been genetically diverse generations. "Doctor, my husband will see you now," Sarah announced, interrupting his examination of the portraits. She led him through a corridor lined with additional family pictures toward what appeared to be a library or study at the rear of the house. Ezra Belmont stood waiting beside a massive desk covered with leather-bound books and papers that appeared to be genealogical records. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, though his exact age was difficult to determine due to physical characteristics that seemed prematurely aged in some respects while remaining oddly youthful in others. His handshake was firm, but Dr. Cartwright immediately noticed that his fingers, like those of Sarah and Matthew, exhibited unusual flexibility and positioning. "Dr. Cartwright, I appreciate your willingness to travel to our ranch," Ezra said, his voice carrying the same peculiar resonance that Dr. Cartwright had noted in Sarah's speech. "My family has developed medical conditions that require professional attention, but I must emphasize that we value our privacy and expect complete discretion regarding any observations you make during your visit." The intensity with which Ezra delivered this expectation, combined with his physical positioning that seemed designed to demonstrate authority and control, suggested that the Belmont family's isolation involved more than simple preference for solitude. Dr. Cartwright found himself wondering what exactly they were so determined to conceal from the outside world. Ezra Belmont's study contained more genealogical materials than Dr. Cartwright had ever encountered in a private residence. Massive leather-bound volumes lined the shelves, their spines labeled with dates stretching back decades, and loose papers covered with family trees and lineage charts occupied every available surface. The sheer volume of documentation suggested an obsession with family history that exceeded normal interest in ancestry. "Dr. Cartwright, before we proceed with medical examinations, I want you to understand the nature of our family's situation," Ezra began, his hands moving restlessly among the papers on his desk. "We have lived in isolation by choice, maintaining traditions and practices that have served our bloodline well for many generations. The symptoms affecting our family members may appear unusual to someone unfamiliar with our particular circumstances." The way Ezra emphasized bloodline, rather than simply saying family, struck Dr. Cartwright as significant, though he could not immediately determine why. His medical training had taught him to pay attention to unusual word choices, as they often revealed important information about a patient's mental state or underlying concerns. "Mr. Belmont, I would be happy to examine your family members and provide appropriate treatment recommendations. However, I should mention that thorough diagnosis often requires understanding the complete medical history of those involved, including any hereditary conditions that might influence current symptoms." Ezra's reaction to this suggestion was immediate and negative. His entire posture stiffened, and his hands moved protectively over the genealogical documents scattered across his desk. "Doctor, our family records are private matters that do not require outside examination. Your focus should remain strictly on treating the immediate symptoms affecting our household members." Dr. Cartwright noted this defensive response while continuing to observe Ezra's physical characteristics. Like Sarah and Matthew, Ezra exhibited subtle abnormalities in his facial structure and hand formation that suggested underlying developmental irregularities. His skin possessed the same unnaturally pale quality, and his movements seemed carefully controlled, as though he were compensating for physical limitations. "Of course, Mr. Belmont. Shall we begin with the examinations?" Ezra led him to a smaller room that had been prepared as a makeshift medical examination area. The space contained adequate lighting and basic furniture, but Dr. Cartwright immediately noticed that heavy curtains blocked all windows, creating an environment of deliberate isolation from the outside world. Sarah entered the room first, still heavily veiled but now accompanied by another family member who had not been previously introduced. This second woman appeared to be in her 30s, with the same pale complexion and careful movements that characterized the other family members. Her introduction as Elizabeth, my daughter, created Dr. Cartwright's first moment of genuine medical alarm. The physical resemblance between Sarah and Elizabeth exceeded anything that could be explained by normal hereditary patterns. Their facial bone structure, hand formation, and even speech patterns were so similar that they could have been taken for sisters rather than mother and daughter separated by what should have been at least 15 years of age difference. Dr. Cartwright began his examination with Sarah, who reluctantly allowed him to check her breathing and pulse while maintaining as much physical coverage as possible. What he discovered challenged his understanding of respiratory ailments entirely. Her breathing difficulties appeared to result not from lung congestion, but from physical deformities in her chest cavity that affected her ability to expand her lungs properly. "Mrs. Belmont, have you experienced chest pain or breathing difficulties since childhood, or are these symptoms of recent development?" Sarah glanced nervously toward Ezra before responding. "The breathing problems have worsened over time, but some degree of difficulty has been present for many years." When Dr. Cartwright examined Elizabeth, he discovered nearly identical respiratory abnormalities, along with additional physical characteristics that deepened his growing concern. Her bone structure exhibited irregularities that suggested developmental problems beginning in early childhood, and her muscle coordination appeared compromised in ways that indicated neurological involvement. "Mr. Belmont, I am observing physical conditions that suggest systemic issues affecting multiple family members. These symptoms typically indicate hereditary factors that might influence treatment decisions." Ezra's response was swift and decisive. "Doctor, our family has dealt with these conditions for generations without outside interference. We require treatment recommendations, not speculation about hereditary factors." As the examinations continued with Matthew and two additional family members who were introduced simply as cousins, Dr. Cartwright documented a pattern of abnormalities that defied coincidence. Every individual examined exhibited similar respiratory difficulties, bone structure irregularities, and neurological symptoms that suggested a common underlying cause. Most disturbing was his growing realization that the physical resemblances between family members who were supposedly of different generations and varying degrees of relationship were far too strong to be explained by normal genetic inheritance. The similarities suggested a degree of genetic concentration that occurred only under very specific circumstances. During a brief moment when Ezra stepped out of the examination room, Dr. Cartwright attempted to engage Sarah in conversation about the family's medical history. "Mrs. Belmont, conditions like those I am observing sometimes run in families across multiple generations. Understanding previous cases could help me develop more effective treatments." Sarah's immediate response was to look toward the door with obvious anxiety. "Doctor, my husband handles all matters related to our family's history. Such discussions are not appropriate for me to undertake." The examination of the final family member, a young man introduced as Thomas, another cousin, provided the most alarming evidence yet. Thomas appeared to be approximately the same age as Matthew, but his physical and developmental characteristics suggested more severe manifestations of the same underlying conditions affecting the entire family. When Dr. Cartwright completed his examinations and returned to Ezra's study, he found the patriarch waiting with obvious impatience and anxiety. The genealogical documents had been cleared from the desk and stored away, as though their contents were too sensitive to remain visible during medical discussions. "What is your diagnosis, doctor?" Ezra asked, his tone suggesting that he expected a simple answer followed by an immediate departure. Dr. Cartwright realized that his response would need to be carefully considered, as the evidence he had gathered suggested implications that extended far beyond typical medical treatment into territory that might challenge everything the Belmont family had constructed around their isolated existence. Dr. Cartwright chose his words carefully as he faced Ezra Belmont across the now-cleared desk. "Mr. Belmont, the conditions I have observed in your family members are complex and appear to have developed over an extended period. The respiratory difficulties, bone structure irregularities, and neurological symptoms suggest systemic issues that require comprehensive treatment approaches." Ezra's expression remained carefully neutral, but Dr. Cartwright noticed increased tension in his posture. "Doctor, we require specific treatment recommendations, not general medical observations. My family has functioned adequately with these conditions for many years. I understand your desire for practical solutions, but effective treatment depends on understanding the underlying causes of these symptoms. Mr. Belmont, I must ask directly about your family's medical history, particularly any similar conditions in previous generations." The question produced an immediate and dramatic change in Ezra's demeanor. His hands clenched into fists, and his voice took on a tone of unmistakable authority. "Dr. Cartwright, our family's history is not subject to outside examination or discussion. You have been brought here to provide medical treatment, nothing more." Dr. Cartwright decided to pursue a different approach. "Perhaps I could examine your genealogical records simply to understand hereditary patterns that might influence treatment decisions. Many families maintain such documentation for precisely these medical purposes." Ezra stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with enough force to emphasize his agitation. "Doctor, those records contain private family information that has no bearing on current medical treatment. I will not permit their examination under any circumstances." The vehemence of this refusal confirmed Dr. Cartwright's growing suspicion that the Belmont family's genealogical documentation contained information they were desperate to conceal. His medical training had taught him that such extreme defensive reactions often indicated the presence of precisely the information most relevant to diagnosis and treatment. "Mr. Belmont, I respect your family's privacy, but I must inform you that the conditions I have observed suggest factors that could significantly impact the health of current and future family members. Proper medical care requires understanding these underlying elements." Ezra moved to the window and stood with his back to Dr. Cartwright, his posture suggesting internal conflict between his desire to maintain family secrets and his obvious concern for the health problems affecting his household. After several moments of silence, he turned back toward the doctor with an expression of reluctant compromise. "Dr. Cartwright, our family has maintained certain traditions and practices that outsiders might not understand or approve of. These practices have been essential to preserving our bloodline and maintaining the purity of our family heritage. Any medical treatment you recommend must work within the framework of these established customs." The specific mention of bloodline purity sent a chill through Dr. Cartwright's professional understanding. His medical training had exposed him to the dangerous consequences of excessive concern with genetic heritage, and he began to suspect that the Belmont family's isolation might involve practices that could explain the physical abnormalities he had observed. "Mr. Belmont, could you clarify what you mean by maintaining bloodline purity? Understanding your family's specific practices would help me develop appropriate treatment recommendations." Ezra's response was evasive but telling. Our family believes in preserving the characteristics that have made us successful and avoiding contamination from outside influences that might weaken our heritage. We have maintained these principles for 3 generations, and they have served us well. Dr. Cartwright felt pieces of a disturbing puzzle beginning to align in his mind. The extreme isolation, the obsessive genealogical record-keeping, the emphasis on bloodline purity, and most significantly, the pattern of nearly identical physical abnormalities across multiple family members who claimed varying degrees of relationship, all pointed toward possibilities that his medical ethics demanded he investigate further. Mr. Belmont, I need to ask specific questions about family relationships and marriage patterns. The physical similarities I have observed among your family members are unusually pronounced and suggest genetic factors that could be crucial for treatment planning. This direct approach produced the strongest defensive reaction yet. Ezra returned to his desk and began shuffling papers with obvious agitation, his movements becoming increasingly rapid and erratic. Doctor, questions about family relationships are completely inappropriate and have no bearing on medical treatment. I will not tolerate such inquiries. Dr. Cartwright realized that pursuing this line of questioning directly would likely result in his immediate dismissal from the ranch, potentially leaving the affected family members without any medical assistance. However, his professional obligations demanded that he find ways to gather the information necessary for proper diagnosis and treatment. Mr. Belmont, perhaps we could focus on the immediate health concerns. However, I should mention that I noticed some family portraits in your parlor that suggest interesting hereditary patterns. Sometimes visual family history can provide medical insights that written records might not capture as clearly. Ezra's reaction to this seemingly innocent observation was immediate and alarmed. Dr. Cartwright, those portraits are private family displays and are not appropriate subjects for medical examination. I must insist that your attention remain focused strictly on treating current symptoms. At that moment, the sound of children's voices drifted in from somewhere deeper within the house, followed immediately by urgent shushing sounds and the rapid movement of footsteps. Dr. Cartwright noted that throughout his entire visit, he had not been introduced to any children, despite clear evidence that young people lived in the household. Mr. Belmont, I should examine all family members who might be affected by these conditions, including any children who may be experiencing symptoms. The suggestion produced perhaps the most dramatic reaction of the entire visit. Ezra moved quickly to block the door leading deeper into the house, his entire body language conveying absolute prohibition. Doctor, there are no children requiring your attention. Your examinations are complete, and I believe it is time for you to provide your treatment recommendations and prepare for your departure. Dr. Cartwright realized that he had reached the limits of what direct questioning could accomplish during this visit, but the evidence he had gathered painted a picture of family practices that demanded further investigation through whatever means might be available to him. Dr. Cartwright returned to Cedar Ridge, with his mind churning over the disturbing patterns he had observed at the Belmont Ranch. The ride down the mountain provided ample time to review his medical findings and consider their implications. Each mile of distance from the isolated compound only strengthening his conviction that the family's situation involved far more than simple respiratory ailments or hereditary weakness. His first priority upon reaching town was to conduct research that might illuminate the questions Ezra Belmont had so vehemently refused to answer. The small settlement's record-keeping was limited, but Dr. Cartwright hoped to find documentation that could provide insight into the family's history and practices without requiring their direct cooperation. Sheriff Whitmore proved surprisingly helpful when approached about accessing territorial records. Doc, I've been wondering what you found up there at the ranch. Your expression suggests it wasn't straightforward consumption treatment. Sheriff, I discovered medical conditions that require understanding the family's background and history. Mr. Belmont was extremely protective of such information, but proper treatment depends on knowing more about hereditary factors that might be involved. Whitmore led him to a small office behind the jail, where territorial records were maintained in wooden filing cabinets that had seen better days. The Belmonts have been in this valley since before official territorial organization. Old-timers remember when they first established their ranch, though even then they kept to themselves more than most settler families. Dr. Cartwright began examining marriage records, land deeds, and other official documents that might shed light on the family's composition and practices. What he discovered in the marriage certificates immediately confirmed his worst suspicions about the nature of their isolation. The documentation revealed a pattern of marriages within the Belmont family that defied both social convention and medical wisdom. Sarah Belmont, according to her marriage certificate, had wed her own brother Ezra in 1820. Elizabeth Belmont, whom Ezra had introduced as his daughter, was listed in subsequent records as being married to Matthew Belmont, who appeared to be her first cousin. Sheriff, these marriage records show relationships between family members that explain the medical conditions I observed. The Belmont family has been practicing deliberate intermarriage for at least 2 generations. Whitmore's reaction suggested this information was not entirely surprising to him. "Doc, I suspected something along those lines, but it's not the kind of situation that territorial law enforcement is equipped to handle. As long as they're not bothering anyone else, most folks figure it's their own business." Dr. Cartwright continued examining the records, finding additional evidence of the systematic nature of the family's practices. Birth certificates revealed children born to parents who were siblings, cousins, and in some cases, relationships that appeared to involve even closer genetic connections. Sheriff, this pattern of intermarriage explains every medical abnormality I observed at the ranch. The respiratory problems, bone deformities, and neurological symptoms are consistent with genetic deterioration caused by excessive inbreeding over multiple generations. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond simple medical treatment. Dr. Cartwright realized he was confronting a situation where an entire family had deliberately isolated themselves to practice customs that were producing increasingly severe health consequences with each successive generation. His research was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Henderson from the Trading Post, who had heard about his return from the ranch and wanted to share additional information. "Doc, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and there are details about the Belmont trading arrangements that might interest you." She settled into a chair across from the desk, where Dr. Cartwright had spread the territorial records. "The man who comes monthly for supplies, he's always paid with old silver coins, the kind that haven't been minted for years. Makes me wonder if they've been hoarding money since they first arrived and haven't had any new income sources since then." "That would be consistent with complete isolation from normal economic activity," Dr. Cartwright replied, making notes about this additional evidence of the family's separation from outside contact. "But here's the peculiar thing, Doc. Over the years, I've noticed that the man who comes for supplies has been getting progressively more affected by whatever physical problems they're dealing with. 5 years ago, his hands seemed nearly normal. Now, his fingers are so malformed that handling coins and goods appears genuinely difficult for him." This observation provided additional confirmation of Dr. Cartwright's diagnosis. Progressive deterioration in physical capabilities suggested that the genetic consequences of the family's practices were becoming more severe over time, potentially threatening their ability to maintain even basic functions. Minister Davidson joined their discussion, having overheard the conversation from the adjacent room. "Dr. Cartwright, I feel obligated to share something that has troubled me for several years. The last time the Belmont family attended church services, I noticed that several of their children appeared to be suffering from conditions that seemed to affect their mental as well as physical development. Can you describe what you observed?" The children seemed unable to follow normal social interactions, and their speech patterns were significantly delayed compared to other youngsters of similar ages. Most concerning, they appeared to have difficulty understanding simple instructions or responding appropriately to social situations. Dr. Cartwright added these observations to his growing documentation of the family's deteriorating condition. The combination of physical abnormalities and developmental delays painted a picture of genetic damage that was likely irreversible and potentially worsening with each generation. Minister, in your interactions with the family, did you observe anything that suggested their isolation was motivated by awareness of these problems? Or did they seem unaware of the severity of their situation? Dr. Cartwright, I believe Ezra Belmont is fully aware of his family's condition, but has convinced himself that their practices are preserving something valuable rather than destroying it. He spoke frequently about maintaining bloodline purity and avoiding contamination from outside influences. The accumulating evidence pointed toward a family trapped in a cycle of practices that were systematically destroying their health, while being justified through ideology that prevented them from seeking appropriate help or changing their behavior. Dr. Cartwright realized he was facing not just a medical crisis, but a situation that challenged his understanding of how to balance respect for family autonomy against the obligation to protect individuals who might not be capable of making informed decisions about their own welfare. Armed with the territorial records and witness testimony, Dr. Cartwright spent the evening in his room at the inn, organizing his findings into a comprehensive understanding of the Belmont family's situation. The marriage certificates, birth records, and eyewitness accounts painted a horrifying picture of systematic inbreeding that had been practiced deliberately for at least 3 generations, with devastating consequences that were becoming more severe over time. The medical evidence he had gathered during his examination of the family members now made complete sense within this context. The identical respiratory abnormalities, bone structure deformities, and neurological symptoms were textbook manifestations of genetic deterioration caused by excessive consanguinity. Most alarming was the progressive nature of the conditions, suggesting that each successive generation was more severely affected than the previous one. Dr. Cartwright's medical training had exposed him to the theoretical consequences of inbreeding, but the Belmont family represented his first encounter with a systematic, multi-generational case that demonstrated the full horror of such practices. The children whose voices he had heard but was forbidden to examine were likely suffering from even more severe manifestations of the genetic damage that was clearly visible in the adult family members. The genealogical records that Ezra Belmont had so desperately protected undoubtedly contained the complete documentation of their family's deliberate isolation and intermarriage practices. Dr. Cartwright realized that these records would provide the final proof of the systematic nature of their situation, but obtaining access to them would require confronting Ezra directly with evidence that could no longer be denied or deflected. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would force the issue beyond Dr. Cartwright's control. Matthew arrived in town before dawn, his horse lathered from hard riding, and his usual pale complexion even more ashen than normal. He dismounted with obvious difficulty and approached the inn with movements that suggested genuine medical emergency. "Dr. Cartwright, you must come immediately," Matthew gasped. His breathing labored from exertion and what appeared to be increasing respiratory distress. "There has been a terrible development at the ranch. Mr. Belmont is demanding your immediate return." Dr. Cartwright quickly gathered his medical supplies while questioning Matthew about the nature of the emergency. "What has happened? Are there injuries, or has someone's condition deteriorated significantly?" "Rebecca has taken a turn for the worse," Matthew replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has been experiencing seizures and periods where she appears to lose consciousness entirely. Mr. Belmont believes her condition may be life-threatening." The mention of Rebecca, whom Dr. Cartwright had glimpsed only briefly during his previous visit, provided the opening he needed to insist on examining all family members regardless of Ezra's previous restrictions. A medical emergency involving a young person would justify more aggressive diagnostic approaches that normal circumstances might not permit. The ride back to the ranch revealed additional concerning details about the family's deteriorating situation. Matthew's own condition had clearly worsened since the previous day, with increased difficulty breathing and coordination problems that made controlling his horse genuinely challenging. His speech patterns had become more labored, and his responses to questions were delayed in ways that suggested neurological involvement. Matthew, how long has Rebecca been experiencing these seizures? Have other family members shown similar symptoms? The episodes began several weeks ago, but have become more frequent and severe in recent days. Elizabeth has also experienced similar problems, though not as dramatically as Rebecca. This information confirmed Dr. Cartwright's worst fears about the progressive nature of the genetic damage affecting the family. The neurological symptoms he had observed during his initial examinations were apparently advancing toward life-threatening complications that could affect multiple family members simultaneously. Upon arriving at the ranch, Dr. Cartwright was immediately led to a bedroom where he encountered Rebecca Belmont for the first time under circumstances that allowed proper medical examination. What he discovered challenged even his prepared understanding of the consequences of systematic inbreeding. Rebecca appeared to be approximately 16 years old, but her physical and mental development suggested severe impairment that affected every aspect of her functioning. Her facial features exhibited extreme manifestations of the bone structure abnormalities he had observed in other family members, combined with neurological symptoms that included involuntary movements, difficulty with speech, and periods of apparent unconsciousness. Most disturbing was her obvious relationship to other family members. The physical resemblances between Rebecca and the adults he had examined previously were so pronounced that determining her exact parentage from appearance alone would be impossible. She could have been the daughter, sister, or even granddaughter of any combination of the family members he had met, and the genetic concentration suggested by these similarities indicated breeding practices that defied even the loose standards of frontier society. Mr. Belmont, Rebecca's condition requires immediate and comprehensive medical intervention. However, I must inform you that her symptoms are consistent with severe genetic complications that cannot be treated through conventional medical approaches. Ezra stood beside Rebecca's bed, with an expression that combined genuine anguish with desperate determination to maintain his family's secretive practices. Doctor, surely there are treatments that can address her seizures and restore her to normal functioning. Mr. Belmont, Rebecca's condition results from the same factors that are affecting all of your family members. The seizures, developmental delays, and physical abnormalities are manifestations of genetic damage that has accumulated over multiple generations. Dr. Cartwright paused, realizing that he was about to confront Ezra with information that would shatter the ideological framework that had justified the family's practices for decades. The marriage patterns documented in your genealogical records have created a situation where genetic defects that would normally be diluted across a broader population have instead become concentrated and amplified within your family. Ezra's reaction was immediate and desperate. Dr. Cartwright, our marriage practices have preserved the purity of our bloodline and maintained characteristics that make our family superior to the contaminated populations in the outside world. Mr. Belmont, your practices have produced exactly the opposite result. The genetic concentration you have pursued has created severe health problems that are threatening the lives of your family members and will likely worsen in future generations. The confrontation that Dr. Cartwright had been dreading finally arrived when Ezra Belmont demanded to know the exact source of his medical conclusions. Standing beside Rebecca's bed, with the young woman's labored breathing providing a constant reminder of the stakes involved, Dr. Cartwright realized that diplomatic approaches had been exhausted, and direct honesty was the only remaining option. Mr. Belmont, I have examined the territorial marriage records, birth certificates, and genealogical documentation available in Cedar Ridge. The evidence clearly shows that your family has been practicing systematic intermarriage between siblings, cousins, and even closer relatives for at least 3 generations. Ezra's face transformed through a series of expressions ranging from shock to rage to desperate denial. Dr. Cartwright, you had no authority to examine private family records or to make judgments about our personal arrangements. Our marriage practices are based on sound principles of bloodline preservation that outsiders cannot understand. Mr. Belmont, the medical evidence is undeniable. Every family member I have examined exhibits physical and neurological abnormalities that are direct consequences of genetic concentration caused by consanguineous marriages. Rebecca's seizures, the respiratory problems affecting Sarah and Elizabeth, and the developmental delays I have observed throughout your household are all manifestations of accumulated genetic damage. Dr. Cartwright moved to the window and gestured toward the genealogical books that lined the shelves in the adjacent study. Your own records undoubtedly contain complete documentation of these marriage patterns. The very documentation you have been so desperate to protect actually provides the evidence that explains your family's deteriorating health. Sarah, who had been standing silently in the corner of Rebecca's bedroom, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of desperate hope mixed with years of suppressed anxiety. Dr. Cartwright, is there treatment that can help Rebecca recover from these episodes? Can the effects of our family's practices be reversed? The question forced Dr. Cartwright to deliver perhaps the most difficult diagnosis of his medical career. Mrs. Belmont, the genetic damage that has accumulated in your family over multiple generations cannot be undone through medical treatment. The seizures, developmental delays, and physical abnormalities are permanent consequences that will likely worsen over time. Ezra's response was immediate and explosive. Doctor, that is impossible. Our family has maintained superior bloodlines through careful preservation of our genetic heritage. We have avoided contamination from inferior outside influences that weaken other populations. Mr. Belmont, your beliefs about genetic superiority are fundamentally incorrect. Human populations require genetic diversity to maintain health and normal development. The practices you have pursued have concentrated harmful genetic variations while eliminating the diversity that would normally prevent such problems. Dr. Cartwright pulled out his notebook containing the medical observations he had documented during his examinations. Every family member I have examined shows evidence of identical genetic defects that have been amplified rather than diluted across generations. The bone structure abnormalities, respiratory complications, and neurological symptoms I have observed are textbook consequences of systematic inbreeding. Sarah moved closer to Rebecca's bed, her hands trembling as she reached toward her daughter with obvious maternal anguish. Dr. Cartwright, what will happen to Rebecca as her condition progresses? Will the seizures become more frequent or more severe? Mrs. Belmont, I cannot provide definitive predictions about the progression of Rebecca's neurological symptoms, but the pattern I have observed suggests that her condition will likely continue deteriorating. The genetic damage affecting her nervous system cannot be repaired through any medical interventions currently available. At this moment, Elizabeth entered the room, her own movements showing increased coordination difficulties compared to Dr. Cartwright's previous observations. Father, I have been experiencing similar episodes to Rebecca's, though less severe. Perhaps Dr. Cartwright's medical opinion deserves consideration. Ezra turned toward Elizabeth with an expression of betrayal and desperate authority. Elizabeth, our family's practices have been successful for decades. The temporary health problems we are experiencing cannot outweigh the importance of maintaining our pure bloodline. Dr. Cartwright realized that Ezra's ideological commitment to his family's practices had become so entrenched that rational medical evidence might never overcome his psychological investment in beliefs that had guided his life for decades. However, Sarah and Elizabeth appeared to be questioning those beliefs in ways that might create opportunities for positive change. Mr. Belmont, I understand that accepting this information challenges fundamental beliefs about your family's practices, but the health of your family members depends on acknowledging the medical reality of their situation. Dr. Cartwright, you are asking me to abandon principles that have guided 3 generations of my family's decisions. These practices have preserved characteristics and abilities that make us superior to the contaminated populations in the outside world. Sheriff Whitmore's unexpected arrival at that moment introduced external pressure that would transform the confrontation from a private family discussion into a matter of official territorial concern. His entrance into Rebecca's bedroom carried the authority of law enforcement and community responsibility that Ezra could no longer simply dismiss or control. Mr. Belmont, I have been reviewing territorial records related to your family's situation, and I believe we need to discuss the welfare of family members who may not be capable of making informed decisions about their own medical care. The sheriff's presence represented the first challenge to Ezra's absolute authority over his household that had occurred in decades. Dr. Cartwright realized that the combination of medical evidence, official investigation, and growing internal family dissent had created a situation that might finally force changes in practices that had been destroying the Belmont family for generations. However, Ezra's response suggested that he would not abandon his beliefs without a final, desperate attempt to maintain control over the situation that was rapidly spiraling, beyond his ability to manage through secrecy and intimidation. Sheriff Whitmore's presence in the Belmont household represented the first time in decades that external authority had penetrated the family's carefully constructed isolation. His examination of Rebecca's condition, combined with his review of the territorial marriage records, provided official confirmation of Dr. Cartwright's medical diagnosis and its implications for the welfare of family members who might be unable to advocate for themselves. Mr. Belmont, territorial law requires that I investigate situations where individuals may be suffering harm due to circumstances beyond their control, Sheriff Whitmore announced, his tone carrying the weight of official responsibility. The medical evidence Dr. Cartwright has presented, combined with the marriage records I have reviewed, suggests that your family's practices may be endangering the health and welfare of vulnerable members. Ezra's response revealed the desperation of a man whose entire worldview was collapsing under the pressure of undeniable evidence. Sheriff, our family's arrangements are private matters that have been conducted according to our religious beliefs and traditional practices. No territorial authority has the right to interfere with our family's internal affairs. Mr. Belmont, when private family practices result in serious medical harm to individuals who cannot protect themselves, those practices become matters of legitimate public concern, Dr. Cartwright interjected, gesturing toward Rebecca's unconscious form. Your beliefs about bloodline purity have produced exactly the opposite of what you intended to achieve. Sarah, who had remained silent during most of the confrontations, suddenly stepped forward with an expression that combined years of suppressed doubt with newfound determination to protect her children. Ezra, we cannot continue pretending that our practices are helping our family when the evidence shows they are destroying us. Her direct challenge to her husband's authority represented the first open rebellion against the patriarchal control that had governed the family's decisions for generations. Elizabeth immediately moved to support her mother's position, creating a coalition of family members who were finally willing to acknowledge the horrific consequences of their isolation and intermarriage practices. Father, Rebecca's condition has been worsening for weeks, and now I am experiencing similar symptoms, Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but determined. Dr. Cartwright's explanations make sense of problems we have been trying to ignore or explain away for years. Ezra's reaction was swift and desperate. He moved to block access to the genealogical records in his study, while making increasingly frantic attempts to justify practices that had become impossible to defend rationally. Our family records contain generations of careful breeding designed to preserve superior characteristics. Abandoning these practices would contaminate our bloodline and destroy everything our ancestors worked to achieve. Sheriff Whitmore approached the study and examined the leather-bound volumes that Ezra was attempting to protect. Mr. Belmont, these records may contain evidence relevant to determining the welfare of family members who are suffering from medical conditions. I have the authority to examine documentation that might be pertinent to their care and protection. The sheriff's review of the genealogical books provided the final, undeniable proof of the systematic nature of the Belmont family's inbreeding practices. Page after page documented marriages between siblings, unions between cousins, and family arrangements that had concentrated genetic defects while eliminating the diversity necessary for normal human development. Dr. Cartwright, these records confirm every aspect of your medical diagnosis, Sheriff Whitmore announced. The marriage patterns documented here explain the health problems affecting every member of this household. Matthew, who had been growing increasingly ill throughout the confrontation, suddenly collapsed with seizure symptoms identical to those affecting Rebecca. His medical emergency provided immediate, dramatic evidence that the genetic damage was progressing rapidly and could potentially threaten the lives of multiple family members simultaneously. Dr. Cartwright's treatment of Matthew's seizure required techniques that demonstrated the severity of the neurological complications affecting the family. Sheriff, this medical emergency illustrates why immediate intervention is necessary. The genetic damage documented in these records is producing life-threatening complications that will likely worsen without significant changes in the family's circumstances. Sarah's anguish over witnessing both her daughter and Matthew suffering from identical symptoms finally broke through years of enforced compliance with her husband's authority. Ezra, we cannot watch our children die to preserve beliefs that are clearly wrong. Dr. Cartwright has shown us the truth about what our practices have done to our family. Ezra's final desperate attempt to maintain control involved threats to refuse all medical treatment and to isolate the family even further from outside interference. However, his threats were undermined by the obvious medical emergencies affecting Rebecca and Matthew, which required immediate professional intervention regardless of his ideological objections. Mr. Belmont, your authority over your family's medical decisions does not extend to preventing treatment for individuals who are suffering from life-threatening conditions, Sheriff Whitmore declared. Rebecca and Matthew require immediate medical care that takes precedence over your family's traditional practices. The collapse of Ezra's authority was accelerated by his own deteriorating health, which had been masked by his determination to maintain patriarchal control, but was revealed under the stress of confronting the failure of his life's work. His breathing difficulties, coordination problems, and obvious physical weakening demonstrated that he too was suffering from the genetic consequences of practices he had spent decades defending. Dr. Cartwright realized that Ezra's physical decline, combined with the medical emergencies affecting younger family members, had created a situation where the family's traditional authority structure could no longer function effectively. The combination of external pressure from territorial authorities and internal rebellion from family members had finally broken through decades of enforced secrecy and ideological control. However, the immediate medical crisis affecting multiple family members required emergency intervention that would determine whether the exposure of the family's secrets had come in time to prevent additional tragic consequences of their systematic inbreeding practices. The resolution of the Belmont family crisis unfolded over the following weeks, as the full extent of their situation became clear to the broader Cedar Ridge community. Ezra's physical collapse, occurring just days after the confrontation with Dr. Cartwright and Sheriff Whitmore, removed the primary obstacle to implementing changes that might preserve the lives of the remaining family members who could still be helped. Dr. Cartwright's emergency treatment of Rebecca and Matthew required transporting them to more suitable medical facilities, a process that revealed the true isolation the family had maintained for decades. Neither patient had ever traveled beyond the immediate vicinity of their ranch, and their reactions to the outside world demonstrated developmental limitations that extended far beyond their documented physical abnormalities. Sarah's decision to cooperate fully with medical authorities represented the first step toward dismantling the secretive practices that had governed her family's existence for 3 generations. Her willingness to discuss the marriage arrangements, family relationships, and breeding practices that Ezra had so desperately protected provided Dr. Cartwright with complete information necessary for understanding the full scope of the genetic damage affecting each family member. Dr. Cartwright, I understand now that our practices were destroying rather than preserving our family, Sarah said during one of their extensive discussions about the family's history. I want to do everything possible to help Rebecca and the others, even if it means abandoning everything we believed about our heritage. The genealogical records that Ezra had guarded so carefully became crucial documents for medical research that could potentially help other isolated populations avoid similar consequences. Dr. Cartwright's analysis of 3 generations of systematic inbreeding provided unprecedented documentation of how genetic concentration could produce progressive deterioration in human populations. Elizabeth's decision to leave the ranch permanently and seek a new life in a distant settlement represented the most dramatic break with family tradition. Her choice to abandon the isolated compound where she had been born and raised required tremendous courage, but her deteriorating health made remaining in the family's traditional environment increasingly dangerous. I cannot watch Rebecca suffer while pretending that our family's ways are correct, Elizabeth explained to Dr. Cartwright as she prepared for departure. Perhaps in a different place, with proper medical care and normal social relationships, I can have a life that doesn't repeat the mistakes of previous generations. Sheriff Whitmore's official investigation resulted in territorial recommendations that the abandoned Belmont ranch be maintained as a cautionary example of the dangers of extreme isolation and ideological extremism. The compound's defensive barriers and isolated location made it unsuitable for normal settlement, but its preservation served as a reminder of how dangerous beliefs could destroy entire families. The community of Cedar Ridge underwent its own period of reflection about the role of willful ignorance in enabling the Belmont family's tragic situation. Minister Davidson led discussions about the balance between respecting family privacy and protecting vulnerable individuals who might be unable to advocate for themselves. We must acknowledge that our community's failure to investigate obvious signs of distress contributed to the suffering of innocent people, the minister said during one of several community meetings addressing the situation. Respect for privacy cannot become an excuse for ignoring clear evidence of harm. Martha Henderson's Trading Post became an informal center for discussions about how isolated communities could identify and address similar situations before they reached the tragic extremes observed in the Belmont case. Her detailed observations of physical changes in family members over time provided a model for recognizing progressive deterioration in other isolated populations. Dr. Cartwright's departure from Cedar Ridge marked the end of his direct involvement in the case, but his detailed medical documentation became part of territorial records that would influence policies regarding family welfare and community responsibility throughout the region. His experience with the Belmont family convinced him that medical practitioners had obligations to investigate situations where ideological beliefs might be endangering vulnerable individuals. Rebecca's long-term care required arrangements that acknowledged both her medical needs and her developmental limitations caused by generations of genetic damage. The specialized facility that agreed to accept her provided the first opportunity she had ever had to interact with people outside her immediate family, though her capacity for normal social development remained severely compromised. Sarah's integration into a new community represented the most successful adaptation among the surviving family members. Her decision to seek employment and social relationships outside the isolated environment where she had spent her entire life required overcoming decades of conditioning that had taught her to fear and avoid contact with the outside world. The medical legacy of the Belmont case contributed to early understanding of genetics and heredity that would eventually influence American approaches to family welfare and community health. Dr. Cartwright's documentation provided evidence that isolated populations required careful monitoring to prevent the concentration of harmful genetic variations. The abandoned ranch itself became a subject of local folklore, with stories passing down through generations about the family that had tried to preserve their bloodline, but had instead destroyed themselves through practices that defied both medical wisdom and social convention. The empty buildings stood as monuments to the dangers of extreme ideological commitment that ignored scientific evidence and human welfare. Years later, medical researchers would study Dr. Cartwright's documentation of the Belmont case as one of the earliest comprehensive examinations of systematic inbreeding in American populations. The case provided crucial evidence about the progressive nature of genetic damage and the importance of maintaining genetic diversity for human health and development. The territorial policies developed in response to the Belmont situation established precedents for community intervention in cases where family practices might be endangering vulnerable members. These policies balanced respect for family autonomy with recognition that extreme isolation could enable harmful practices that required external oversight and intervention. The story of the Belmont family served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing ideological purity at the expense of human welfare, demonstrating how beliefs about genetic superiority could produce exactly the opposite results through practices that concentrated harmful variations, while eliminating the diversity essential for normal human development.